practicing about the 15-second testimony thing. Do you have a story like that?
I love your shoes, man. Those are so cool.
That's important.
Because right now, where we are, people will say, oh, yeah,
There it is.
I prayed to Jesus. Yeah, I did that.
Good evening. Thank you for being back for our Tuesday night session with Dr. Bobby Kelly and Sermon on the Mount. Amen? Yeah. It's going to be a great time. Grateful that you're here. If you haven't been here for some reason, this is your first time, there are notes pages back in the back table, just behind Dan Leslie there. He'll wave. That table is right back over there. And then over at the Welcome Center, please pick up the notes pages. They're the same all week, so they don't change. And then you'll notice those love offering envelopes as well. We'll be taking up that offering tomorrow evening, but you also can place those in any of the offering boxes, just like the one back there by the notes table. Let me pray for us, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Kelly. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the good and sweet fellowship that is happening in this room. We thank you for the encouragement that we have found. Even as I talked about being salt and light with our own staff today, Lord, that we're not passive, that we're active in doing what you're calling us to do within this sermon. So, Lord, I pray that you would speak through Dr. Kelly tonight. Speak to us by the power of your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Well, I could tell driving in tonight that you all got a little more precipitation than we had in Shawnee last night. I mean, there was slush in the parking lot out there. So we didn't have any. We had just a skimming. But it was a little chilly and windy, and it looks like it's going to get worse as the week wears on. We're going to be fine through tomorrow night. But I'm supposed to be at IBC, Emmanuel, in Shawnee starting Sunday. Jeff DiGiacomo, is the pastor there now. So last year was the first year he was the pastor, and so we did January Bible study. And man, we had snow one night, and we ended up actually having it, but not people couldn't get there. But we videoed it and did it on the live stream, and then it was okay the next night. But it was definitely cold and snowy. And now we're supposed to start Sunday of this coming week. And so he called me when I was on the way up here, and I said, I'm on the way. He texted me, actually, and I quickly texted back and said, I'm driving. I'll call you later. And so then he calls, and I told him, I said, I think in all the years that I've done January Bible study at Quail Springs, I don't think we've ever missed one night, one session. And now we're 2 for 2 with you at IBC with weather issues. So, but we've got some options for it. But yeah, looks like maybe we'll just have to wait and see. It's going to be cold. That they always get the temperature, but this far out, I'm not paying it. I'm going to wait till like 48 hours before, and then you can start to see what it's going to do. But in 20 some years of doing this, and doing, pretty full schedule in January, February, I've only missed like 2. Only like 2 times have I had to cancel. And I remember one of them was First Ponca City, and that was a real doozy of a winter storm that hit that time. That we knew it was coming. There was like one of those, no doubt about it, and it did hit. It was bad. And then maybe one other time or something like that. So we've been very fortunate. But somehow, here we are, January every year, and we just don't even have to miss like one session. Now, as I say that, we'll probably wake up to 6 inches of snow in the morning. Well, good to see you tonight. Glad you're able to be here. And if you're a Michigan fan, you're feeling good today about football anyway. If you're a Washington fan, you're wondering what truck hit you. So that was rough. But anyway, on to the Sermon on the Mount. So if you've got your hand out there, you can turn. I'll go through it here. First page. We did that in the first hour. front and back. And then the next page, the front, where it says structure and exegesis, we did that last night, or excuse me, second session Sunday night. That's the Beatitudes. And then the witness of the greater righteousness in the world. You see that? Got to turn to the back of that page that says structure and exegesis. Turn to the back of that. The witness of the greater righteousness of the world. We talked about salt, light, city on a hill. And then the thesis statement about Jesus said, I didn't come to destroy the law. I came to, or to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. And not the smallest mark, not even the dot of an I will pass away. But all these things will reach their fulfillment, and a curse on those who either don't do them or who teach others not to do them. And then he ends that section with, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you can't enter into the kingdom. So what's this greater righteousness look like? That's where we were kind of in the middle of a section when we ended last night. So the top of the next page says, the greater righteousness in relation to God's law. So when he says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, their righteousness was very much rooted in living out the Mosaic law. Not Genesis, there's only really circumcision is the only command in Genesis, but when you get to Exodus chapter 20, that's where you start running into the beginning of the 613 commandments that you'll find. The big 10 are right there in Exodus 20, but if you keep reading through Leviticus, Numbers, through Deuteronomy, you got about 613 commandments there. Well, that was the traditional teaching. That was the scripture for the Jewish people, and so this was the part of their scripture that the Pharisees and scribes really focused their attention on. They were very much about living according to the law. They held a very high view of scripture, of the Old Testament. In fact, and I know this sounds like it's a put down to us today, but I don't mean it that way at all. But if we could have a conversation with a first century Pharisee about Scripture, we'd walk away saying, well, those people really believe the Bible. I mean, we would find that they would share a lot of our views about God, about the Bible. And I think because Jesus, on occasion, finds himself at odds with them, we think they just always wear the black hat, like they're the bad guys. And that's not true in general, but they did have some issues. And so when Jesus says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you can't enter into the kingdom, that could leave somebody thinking, well, then I'm done. It's over. I could never be more righteous than they are. I could never live more by the law than they do. And so for those who might have that feeling, Jesus says, okay, here's what that would look like. And that's what we began with. So let's open up now to the Sermon on the Mount, we're in chapter 5, and we started at verse 21. The first one is, you've heard it said, thou shalt not murder, but I say unto you, if you have anger in your heart, you've committed murder already. And we talked about that. So you got the traditional teaching, the Torah, thou shalt not murder. Then you've got the true intent, if you have anger in your heart. And I talked about this last night. It looks like Jesus is trying to get behind the action itself to where those cycles begin that lead to murder. So don't go down the road of being angry and then insulting and then escalating the insult to the harshest of insults. You're now starting down these vicious cycles that are going to end in murder. So he's getting at the true intent, which is to head these emotions off before they end in murder. The second one is, you've heard it said, but I say unto you, and it involves adultery. So it's verse 27. You've heard that it was said you should not commit adultery. That's the traditional teaching. But I say to you, everyone who looks upon a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So now we get exactly the same pattern as we had with respect to murder. There's not just these random acts of sexual immorality. It begins with lust. Again, there is a pattern. There's sort of these cycles or these very bad paths that we start down. And yes, you could brag, I've not committed adultery, but Jesus is trying to get behind the action, the actual act itself, to head that off before we start down these vicious cycles that end in adultery. So that's the second, and then we got the third in verse 31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. And of course, that's Deuteronomy 24, where Moses is issuing these certificates of divorce. The true intent is, I say to you, everyone who divorces his wife except on the grounds of sexual immorality, marital infidelity, makes her an adulteress, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So he's like making the Mosaic command more stringent. Moses was passing out these certificates of divorce. He's got a very rigid view, a very conservative view on that issue of divorce. He does give the exception of sexual immorality, but even then, it's not like a mandate that you have to get divorced. That's the escape clause that he offers. But the best course of action, if possible, would be reconciliation. And so I always I tell students I don't have time to do a lot of the premarital counseling. I do quite a few weddings, but I've got some people I say you need to see this person for the counseling. But when I've done the counseling, and I've made this clear to my son, who was sitting over here on Sunday night with his fiance, when he was talking about getting the ring and all of that, I always have that conversation, and I do not mean to cast marriage in the metaphor that it's like prison. So I don't mean it that way. But I say, you need to think about this like you're walking into a room with no exits. And you have to feel comfortable walking into that room with no exits. And if you say, well, I'm a little claustrophobic in my relationships here. I want to make sure there's a door out if I need it. Then don't walk into that room. You have to commit yourself that this will work, and I will do everything within my power as a human being to make this work, and I'm going to make a commitment to do this, and I won't be swayed by if I wake up one morning and I just don't feel like I feel on the time when he was saying he wanted to buy the ring. Maybe you don't have all those feelings on a given day. But you don't think about how do I get out. You think, I'm committed to this. How do I make this work? And if there's a break in trust, then how can we be reconciled? But in the case of sexual immorality, there might be a break in trust that is so severe that it can't be repaired. And Jesus is acknowledging that. So is there only one exception? Well, Jesus only provides one exception. But in 1 Corinthians 7, where I told you, you'll notice he doesn't provide the transforming action like he does in the first two. Pluck out an eye or put down your offering and go make things right. He doesn't offer the transforming action for this third one on divorce. But I found it, I think, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, about verse 11, where he says to those who are thinking about divorce, be reconciled. But in that 1 Corinthians 7, Paul does mention that if you're a believer and you are married to an unbeliever. Now, Paul would never encourage such a situation, but I think what he's thinking about, people at Corinth who were unbelievers, who were married, and one of the two becomes a believer. Now a believer is married to an unbeliever. he says, that's no reason for you to get out of the marriage. You can't say, boy, this person's not very good for my spiritual life, so I'm going to divorce them. Paul does not offer that as an exception. The way it works is if the non-believing spouse wants out. If you become a believer and your non-believing spouse says, I don't want to be married to you anymore. I don't want to be married to a Christian. I don't want to live like that. I don't want to live in a relationship like that. I want out. Well, then you're free. But the non-believing spouse has to be the one who initiates that. So there's two exceptions. That's the only two that are offered explicitly. But it does give you pause that well, maybe if somebody had said to Paul or to Jesus, like, my husband is abusive. Well, that might have occasioned another exception. Jesus was never asked about that. So I want to be careful that there could be some other actions that could so break that unity that it would be a situation where God would acknowledge the two are no longer one. But I wouldn't go much beyond that. I mean, I couldn't tell somebody to go back to an abusive relationship. Now, if they could be reconciled, that'd be. But if it's not possible to be comfortable and feel safe in a relationship, then I cannot imagine telling somebody you got to go back into that. But I mean, we're just talking. I got maybe three exceptions then: the two that are explicit, and another one that seems like it would break that unity. But that's about as far as I'm willing to go. If you come and talk to me, I'm going to say, be reconciled. My thing's going to be, what can we do? What kind of counseling might you get? What could we do that could help this relationship be reconciled? And that would always be the goal. So, other than that, I'm saying there's no exits. So you better feel comfortable walking into a room without them. And I always say, now, marriage is not a prison. But it's just the best illustration I can think of. If you can think of a better one that doesn't seem like a prison escape room kind of analogy, something you're desperate to get out of, then lay it on me, and maybe I'll change my illustration there. Now we move on to the new one. So if you look in Matthew 5:33, we get the fourth of the six. So we've got the first three. This one focuses on the issue of honesty, of truth-telling. So it was 2008, actually. I had to look up. I remembered the episode, but I couldn't remember when it ran. But I looked it up. I actually found the episode. It's amazing what you can Google and find. But it was February the 25th, 2008. The Fox network, not Fox News, the Fox network, was running a show called The Moment of Truth. And I don't know if any of you will recall it as I talk about it. I think it lasted, maybe they broke it into 2 seasons, but it actually covered just about a year. So February 25th, 2008, that episode I actually saw. I might have seen a couple of others, but this one really left a mark on me. So the whole point of the show was that they would, somehow you would, try to get, you wanted to be on the show, you'd notify them in some way. If you were selected, they would bring you to California, and they would put you on a polygraph test. They'd ask you 50 questions. And the questions started with things that depending on what you did and where you were from, they might ask you questions, like, I don't know, does it embarrass you that most of the people from Kentucky don't use forks to eat their food, or something like that, or don't wear shoes, or something, just sort of that kind of question. And then they'd start getting more serious. And so in this particular episode, the woman who was being, you don't see them asking her the questions on the polygraph. This is done in total behind the scenes, months before the actual episode would air, and there would be the live show. So you're asked these 50 questions. They start with, I think she was a hairdresser. So like a question like, have you ever told someone that you like their hair when in fact you didn't? So she answers, yes or no, and the polygraph is running. She has no idea whether the polygraph shows she was telling the truth or not. They ask her the 50 questions. And then they get more and more personal to the point where it gets really uncomfortable, but it could also be the kind of a discomfort that would cause people to want to watch the show. So I didn't see her being asked the questions, but I knew that happened in the background. Now the show is live on Fox, and she's there, and her parents are there, and her husband's there on the stage with her. Now, she's sitting there in a chair. She's not on the polygraph now. She's already done the polygraph. Now they will start asking her the questions again on stage, live, and she will give an answer. And if her answer matches the polygraph's answer, she wins money. So like, have you ever lied to someone about whether or not you like their hair? I think she actually said no. And then you hear the voice of the polygraph giving the answer that the polygraph has determined. And it's no. And so that's a match. Everybody claps. She's got like $100. She's got a long way to go to win the like 100,000. So the questions get more private. Have you ever stolen money from an employer? She says no. Polygraph says yes. Well, she didn't win any money. And you get like 3 strikes, something like that, as I recall. But then they start getting more personal. Like, on the day of your wedding, were you actually in love with a former boyfriend on the day of your wedding? Now, her husband's sitting on the stage, to which she says, yes. Polygraph voice, yes. And then, of course, the camera goes right to her husband sitting there on the stage. And if you're starting to feel a little discomfort, well, you're starting to understand what the show's about. And this utter look of betrayal on his face is actually sort of burned in my memory. I can still remember that guy's face. Then she asked the question, then guess what's next? They go to commercial break. They come back. Guess who they bring out on the stage? Frank, a former boyfriend that she'd known to have had. And they ask her then a question about, have you been on social media trying to look him up or see where he was or something like that? Of course, she said yes, and the polygraph was yes. And then he gets to ask a question. His question that he asked her, which was one of those 50 questions, but his question was, if I told you today that I loved you and wanted to be with you, would you leave your husband? And she says yes. Polygraph says yes. She told the truth. And then, of course, the last question was, have you had sexual relations with a man other than your husband since you've been married to your husband? Her answer, yes. Polygraph, yes. She won money. But the fallout from the show, and you can look it up. You can Google this episode. They got a divorce as a result of the show. Now, you could say she told the truth. And she did in a lot of those questions. But is that show? Is that about the truth? Is that what that was about? Watching that show And her being asked those questions, and her answering them, and just the mortification of her family and her husband there, is that telling the truth? I would suggest that that's not telling the truth, that's mocking the truth. And that's an attempt to use the truth for financial gain, for viewers. That's not what truth-telling is about. The fact is, telling the truth can be a more complex question than we often understand. I have people tell me, well, I've never told a lie. Or I just won't tell a lie. And I'm always wondering, where's the polygraph? But I'm not sure that's something to brag about. Because telling the truth can be a really profound question to think about, and we don't often think about it. A modern example that demonstrates what I'm trying to get at. Like that show, I think, demonstrates that just telling the truth is not always what one should do in a moment. There can be situations where maybe there's a better way to protect the truth even. So a modern example of what I'm talking about, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He's a German theologian. I think almost everybody's heard of Bonhoeffer these days. But he was born in 1906. In 1927, at the age of 21, he graduated from the University of Berlin with a PhD in theology. His dissertation was on Karl Barth. And within just a few years, I think it was at the age of 24, so 3 years later, he got after studying in the U.S. for a couple of years at Union Seminary in New York. He returned to Germany, and he got a teaching appointment at the University of Berlin, where he graduated, and that was 1931. So he's a very young man to have a PhD and to have a teaching post like the University of Berlin. So his star is on the rise. But what else is going on in Germany in the early 1930s? Somebody else's star was on the rise. Yeah, Adolf Hitler. In January of 1933, just 2 years after he took his position at the University of Berlin, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Later that year, just a few months later, in April of 1933, Hitler declared a day of boycott of Jewish shops and businesses. He said it was a liberation of Germans from Jewish rule. 1 week later, he introduced the Aryan Clause, a law that excluded any Israelite, any Jewish person, from positions in the government, in the university, or in the state churches, the German church. While the majority of Germans got caught up in this nationalism, and some churches even have like swastikas that they allowed to be put up in their churches, they were taking oaths to Hitler as Führer. Bonhoeffer was one of the first pastors and theologians to speak out. In May 1934, so this is just about a year after the Aryan Clause and the Jewish boycott, he and about 100 other pastors issued a statement of civil disobedience against the Third Reich, against the regime. And they issued what was called the Barmen Declaration. And this was the beginning of the confessing church in Germany. This was the alternative to the German church, which was just supporting Hitler, which had become a sort of a mouthpiece. They were making theological arguments for what the Nazis were doing. Well, the confessing church was taking a completely different tack. Their declaration was, there is no Führer but God. As the Nazis began to openly persecute and even murder Jews, in fact, enacting the Holocaust, Bonhoeffer's opposition grew. So much so that he began to fear for his life because he was speaking out rather openly. In 1939, Bonhoeffer escaped to the U.S., back to Union Seminary in New York, where he had attended school for a couple of years. Now he was back with a teaching post. He stayed for only a short time. He explained his decision to return to Germany in a letter to Reinhold Niebuhr. He writes, I've made a mistake in coming to America. I shall have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share in the trials of the time with my people. Upon his return to Germany, his fate was sealed. He did have a brother-in-law who was a major player in what was known as Abwehr, which was like their military counterintelligence, German military counterintelligence. And he was able, because of his connections with his brother-in-law, to get a certificate as an indispensable, which meant he would have the freedom to travel and to Europe, other parts of Europe, even the U.S. if he wanted, but they were supposed to be traveling in order to gather information for the Nazis. In fact, what he was doing when he traveled was alerting other nations in Europe to the atrocities that were going on in Germany. Dietrich Bonhoeffer had become a double agent. Under the guise of an indispensable and a member of German counterintelligence, he was alerting other nations to what the government was doing. He was part also of a conspiracy. He was part of the planning of a conspiracy to have Hitler murdered. It would not work, but the attempt was made. On April the 5th, 1943, he was arrested by the Gestapo and placed in the Tegel prison. During interrogations, they wanted to know who else was involved in the spreading, telling people about what was going on in Germany. Who else was acting as double agents? Where did he get this? How was he able to do this? He would tell them nothing. In fact, he would give them information to put them off on the wrong path. Did I mention that he wrote a book on the Sermon on the Mount? He knew Matthew 5:33 through 37 better than any of us. Again, you've heard that it was said to the men of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you've sworn. But I say to you, don't swear at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Here is the action, the transforming action. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything else comes from the evil one. And you can read his book, Cost of Discipleship. It's one of the most impactful books on the Sermon on the Mount in history. And he talks about being truthful, being honest. He's well aware of this passage. So let's think a little bit more about what the passage actually has to say. What is the traditional teaching? You have heard it said, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you've sworn. That's the traditional teaching. Now that's actually sort of two Old Testament passages. One is Leviticus chapter 19, verse 12. Let me read you that one first. Do not swear falsely by my name, and so profane the name of the Lord. I am the Lord. So do not swear falsely. It's a call to tell the truth. Thou shalt not lie. It's another way of coming at thou shalt not lie. Do not swear falsely by my name and so profane the name of your God. Look at then Numbers chapter 30, verse 2. This would be the other passage that he sort of seems to have combined here. When a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word. He must do everything he has said. It's about swearing oaths. So it's about truth-telling and not swearing oaths. That's the original commandment. That's the traditional teaching. But I say to you, here's the true intent. Do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king, or for by your own hair. We're talking about down to second and third level kinds of oaths. You can swear by God, by God's name, But he's gone all the way down to like swearing by your own hair, the hair of your head. It's clear that the true intent is to do away for even the need for oath-taking. What Jesus completely understood and is trying to address here is that the very presence of oaths alerts us to the fact of lying. People manipulating the truth, not quite telling it straight. If there was no lying, there would be no need for oaths. If everybody told the truth, then it wouldn't require you saying, I swear it's true. The presence of oaths tells us that there's the presence of lying and people who misrepresent the truth, or else there wouldn't be any oaths. What Jesus is trying to do away with is the whole concept of oath-taking. Well, what would be necessary to do away with oaths? People would have to be honest. You would have to demonstrate by your life and by you consistently telling the truth that what your yes is yes and your no is no, and there's no need to try to manipulate someone into believing a lie. He's trying to do away with the whole idea of dishonesty. People who would manipulate the truth. And so, he's trying to destroy oaths altogether because they threaten the truth. So what's the action? What's the transforming action? Let your yes be yes and your no, no. Every word that you or I utter should be spoken with the recognition that it is spoken in God's presence, whether God's name is sworn or not. If we strive to tell the truth rather than being dishonest and telling things that are not true, then there will be no need for oaths. But back to Bonhoeffer. How do we define a lie? What is a lie? What qualifies as a lie? Bonhoeffer was not the first to struggle with this question. Immanuel Kant sets up an interesting picture of what a lie is, which he defines as intentionally deceptive speech. That's what he considers to be a lie. But he sets up this picture, this illustration, this situation. Let's say that you're in bed at sleep tonight. It's 2 a.m. Suddenly you're awakened by somebody banging on your front door. You run to the front door, you look out the peephole, and there's a woman standing out there, and she's screaming that a man's trying to kill her. A man with an axe is after her, and he wants to kill her, and she needs help. Let me in. And your determination in that moment is, this is a woman in real distress. So you open the door, you bring her in. She starts to tell you what's going on and why this man's after her with an axe. You tell your spouse to call 911. She's dialing 911. You can hear her on the phone. And then you hear another. Guess who's at the door? A man with an axe. And the man yells through the door, have you seen a woman? Distressed, bloody, hair all mussed up. Have you seen a woman like that? Did she come in your house? Do you have an obligation in that moment to answer yes? Kant says yes. That is your obligation in the moment. John Wesley agreed with him. He said, this is Wesley, I would not tell a willful lie to save the souls of the whole world. Bonhoeffer obviously did not agree. During his incarceration at Tegel prison in Berlin, Bonhoeffer was working on a book on ethics. Not just on the Sermon on the Mount, but ethics more generally. It's a work he was not able to complete. But in an unfinished chapter entitled, What is Meant by Telling the Truth? Now, this isn't you and me trying to decide about, whether to own up to why we overslept. We're talking about a man who's in prison because he was trying to subvert the Nazi regime. And they continue to interrogate him and try to get more information about people they saw as opponents. And he is not telling them the truth on a daily basis. And he's struggling with Matthew 5, 33 through 37. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. He's wrestling with these profound questions of the truth. He suggested that the truth is actually something that is precious and that is a covenant between people who have a certain relationship. He gives the example of parents who, when their children are young, for example, might not give a fully truthful answer when a child asks a question. Now, he wasn't talking about whether or not there's a, jolly red man at Christmas time. But like maybe your 8-year-old asks you, where do children come from? Or, really, what's in a hot dog? Those are the kinds of questions where I was not fully truthful at 8 when actually one of my kids did ask me, where's a hot dog come from? And I think I just said a pig or something. I didn't tell them the truth because I knew they would probably never eat a hot dog again. And that was like a go-to quick meal when Dad was in charge. Bonhoeffer gives the illustration of a teacher. There was a teacher, he says, who taught elementary school children. And a child, probably 10 years old, was in his class. The teacher knew the child's father. They'd been rivals in previous days. And he knew that the child's father was an alcoholic. So he would often on a Monday morning begin by questioning the child in front of the class. So, did your dad get drunk this weekend? Well, what was the truth? Yes, he did. But the child would tell the teacher no. Bonhoeffer suggested that was not a lie, because the purpose for which he was soliciting that answer and the relationship he had with the child did not owe him the truth in that moment, because he wanted to do with the truth something very much like the Moment of Truth on Fox Network was doing in 2008. Mock the truth. Use the truth in a destructive way. And so, to turn the image slightly towards my teaching, from time to time I ask a question in class where the answer is not brilliant. Not often. And those of you that I've had your sons and daughters at OBU, they always gave brilliant answers. But it's some of those kids from other churches. When I asked a penetrating question about the Trinity, for example, may have actually spoken heresy. And what's my response? That's the dumbest answer I've ever heard. No, I've never said that in class. I've never said, well, you're a heretic. Not and meant it. I might have jokingly, but not and meant it. What's my duty in that moment? That's what Bonhoeffer was struggling with. Well, let's go back to the Bonhoeffer story and actually the end and what is the cost of truthfulness. He continues to struggle with his role as he's writing this book on ethics. On July the 20th, 1944, the resistance launched a final attempt to assassinate Hitler, a plan he had helped concoct. He was part of the planning. Colonel Klaus von Schlossenberg carried a bomb into a meeting room that was supposed to detonate and Hitler would be dead. But something went wrong. Either not all of the explosives went off, or where he placed it at the table, the large leg of the chair caused him not to be hit with the full blast, but Hitler survived the attempt. And He was sure once he survived, he would get everyone who was involved in the plot. And of course, Bonhoeffer was one of the people who had plotted. By April 1945, he was moved to Flossenburg concentration camp. He was brought before a court-martial committee where he offered no defense. And on the morning of April the 9th, 1945, he was marched naked to the gallows and hanged. Now listen to that date. April the 9th, 1945. Less than 1 month later, the war was over in Europe. And yet the question remains, what does it mean to tell the truth? Most of the ethical reflection on Bonhoeffer's life is like, how do we live our lives on these ethical margins? He's in the midst of the Holocaust and trying to work to subvert it. What would you do in that moment? Or a woman who's being chased by a man with an axe, pounding on the door in the middle of the night. What are you going to do in that moment? Well, just to be honest with you, in those moments, I can't tell you what to do. I don't know what I'd do. I will throw myself upon the mercy of God and do the best I know to do in that moment. But here's the truth. Do you know how many times in your life you're going to be faced with living your life on those kinds of ethical margins? Probably, maybe never. But here's what I know. Probably sometime after you leave here tonight, or when you get up in the morning, you go off to work or school and you start interacting with people, you'll be faced with the question of whether or not you will tell the truth. Whether you'll be an honest person. It might be why you were late for work. So the truth is, you stayed up too late, you overslept, you didn't hear the alarm. But you come up with a story that sort of makes you look like it was something you could not have prevented. I don't know. The electricity went out in your house and your phone died, and so the alarm didn't go off. Who could help that? Or maybe it's more serious. Maybe you're on Facebook. Maybe you're like that woman on the Moment of Truth and you're searching for somebody that you dated before you got married, and your wife says, who are you looking up there? And you don't tell the truth. Or maybe man's looking at pornography on his computer and his wife says, were you looking at pornography last night? And you say no. Those are the moments we're likely to face, or moments like that. And those are the moments where there's no ethical decision to make. You know what the truth is. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And you live that kind of life of truthfulness. When you tell the truth in those moments, there'll be no need to swear oaths. People will know that if you say yes, the answer is yes. If you say no, the answer is no. We don't talk enough about truth-telling and the challenges of living a fully honest life. We should probably say more. And then on retaliation, Matthew 5:38 through 42. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, that's the Mosaic code. We're not supposed to live like that now that Jesus has come. That's the traditional teaching, Exodus 21:24. Jesus adds to it, I say to you, do not, now here's what your translation probably says, something like, do not resist one who is evil. Do not resist one who is evil. Now just think about that. Boy, that would put Bonhoeffer in a really bad light. It was like he really messed up trying to subvert the Nazi regime. He should not have resisted. If that's what Jesus is saying. And Jesus' whole life was about resisting evil. It almost makes Jesus feel a little hypocritical if his whole life's about resisting evil, and then he says to his followers, don't resist evil. It just doesn't make sense. And I'm not sure where we get the translation, do not resist evil. It probably goes back to the Tyndale translation, and then that played a big role in the way the King James was translated, and a lot of our translations today are still harking back to decisions made in the King James translation. But you can also translate this line, but I say to you, do not resist or retaliate by evil means. Now, you can translate it that way just as easily. The grammar, that's just as likely a way to translate that. Do not resist or retaliate by evil means. Now, which sounds more like what Jesus would say? Do not resist evil, or do not resist evil, or do not resist by evil means. I think the latter is more likely. We should resist evil. But what Jesus is saying is, don't resist evil using evil's means and methods. The old fight fire with fire, that ain't the stuff of the kingdom. You should resist, but not by evil means. And so, well, what would that look like? How would I do that? Well, thankfully, he gives us the transforming action. Look at the second part of verse 39. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And he's very explicit there. He doesn't just say someone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other. He's very explicit on the right cheek. Correct? So if I really wanted to give Neil a hard time, see, I could do it because he's got his arm in that brace. He couldn't really fend me off very well. I'd have a clear shot. But let him have it. You got a lot of friends here, Neil. So this is Neil's right cheek, right? So in order for me to strike him on his right cheek, this is a very cultural statement that Jesus makes. In order for me to strike him on his right cheek, the left hand's off the table. In a lot of cultures, the left hand is the hand that it's sort of unclean. You do dirty things with the left hand. It would be, this is an honor-shame culture, sort of a shame for you to do things like anything like this public with your left hand. Sorry, left-handed people. You've lived with that kind of shame your whole life, though, haven't you? But you assume the right hand. And if I'm going to strike Neil on the right cheek, how must I strike him? With the back of the hand. It's the, oh, good acting, good acting. I'm glad I didn't get closer. They'd have thought I did it. But that's the backhand slap. That's not like I'm trying to harm him physically. It's not like you students say, like, well, if somebody attacks me in the Walmart parking lot, can I fight back? That's not what this is about. I would say to them, yes, you should defend yourself and get out of there as quickly as possible. You don't have to stand there and just say, keep hitting me. It's not about trying to murder him. It's about trying to humiliate him. It's about trying to show him that I'm the superior here. You know who you hit with the backhand? A slave or an inferior. I'm trying to humiliate him. I'm trying to put him in his place. I'm trying to treat him as if he's someone less than human. What's Jesus' response to that? If the answer was do not resist evil, then it might just be, well, just keep letting him hit you. But turn to him the other. Now, if I'm going to hit Neil on the other cheek, the left, how do I have to hit him? With the open hand, which is the way you would strike an equal. It is a subtle way to resist. You got options in those kinds of moments, fight or flight. You can just start wailing back. Jesus doesn't recommend that. You can run away. Jesus doesn't really recommend that either. This is like nonviolent resistance. By turning the other cheek, you are reclaiming something of your dignity of a human being. You're saying, okay, you want to treat me like an inferior? Well, you hit me again, but you'll have to hit me like an equal. look at the next one. He gives more. You might expect, maybe I need to give more illustrations here of what this would look like. If anyone would sue you and take your coat, that is your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Now, somebody is suing to take your undergarment. This would mean you don't have anything left. You're down to your undergarment and your cloak, your outer garment for warmth. That's all that you have left. And somebody is suing you to take you to court to take your undergarment. Jesus says, you standing there in court, they're reading the charges against you. Just give them the tunic and your outer garment. Now, how are you standing there? There's nothing left. You're naked, which would be quite the spectacle. But why are you naked? Because this dirty, rotten louse is trying to take your undergarment. What kind of person would do that? It shows a person for who they are. Verse 41, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him too. So Roman military had the right in lands they occupied to compel someone to carry that pack, which could be somewhere between 60 and 80 pounds, for a mile. That's a Roman mile. It's less than a mile that we think about today, but still a distance. But Roman law was very clear. They could only compel you to carry it 1 mile, no further. Of course, this keeps down uprising. You know, if they pick your 65-year-old mother to carry that 65-pound pack for 4 hours, you know, people might finally just say, that's all we can stand. 1 mile. Jesus says, carry it too. Just keep going. Don't stop at 1 mile. Just keep going. Now, how many times would you think some Roman military person compelling somebody to carry that pack has seen that happen? Probably never. But what a spectacle that would be with you marching another mile with the pack while the soldier's saying, hey, put that down. Hey, you, put that down. It calls attention that this man is a clown. These are examples of nonviolent resistance. It's not refusing to resist. It is resistance, but it's not resisting by evil means. Now, I don't know what situation you might find yourself in where somebody's trying to treat you as less than human or to be dismissive of you. But pray the Lord in those moments give you the wisdom to find a way to resist in a way that is not using their evil means. You don't just return insult for insult or evil for evil, but a way to resist in which it shows them for who they are. And then 5:43 through 48, the last one. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, love your neighbor, that's Leviticus 19:18. I can't find thou shalt hate your enemy in the Old Testament. There's no commandment like that. But you could infer that from like the commands to go in and kill everybody in Jericho or whatever, or when they're taking the land from those people who lived in the Philistines, who lived in Canaan, and they're going in and taking the land in Jericho or whatever city. You might infer from that you can hate your enemies. Jesus says maybe you've heard it phrased like that. Hate your enemy. But I say to you, and here he offers the transforming action. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. That's the transforming action. Love your enemies. Wow. And pray for those who persecute you. Wish them well. Do things, act in such a way for their well-being. It reminds me of Jeremiah telling those who are going to be carried away into Babylonian captivity to do everything they can to help Babylon and the cities in which they live to be successful and to flourish. And of course, Jesus lives this out on the cross. I mean, he walks the talk. In that moment, what does he pray? Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. In verse 46, you get the true intent. So he reverses them here. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Even the tax collectors do that. Doesn't say much for tax collectors, does it? When you're the group that he can plug in for even they do that, you know, they're the lowest, you know. And if you salute only your brethren, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do that? So for a Jewish audience, even the tax collectors and even the Gentiles do those just bare minimum kinds of things. So you can't brag about loving the people who love you or greeting your brothers, your brothers and sisters. You don't get claps for that. Even the Gentiles do that. So what's the transforming action? What's the stuff of the kingdom? I mean, shame on you if you don't love the people who love you, but you can't claim, well, hey, I really love the people who love me and think you've done something. Jesus says, hey, even the most despised among us do that. But what's the stuff of the kingdom? Love your enemies. And that doesn't mean just saying I love them. That means acting in ways that would be in their best interest. And then 48 makes a lot more sense in light of all that. You, therefore, must be complete. I don't like perfect because it has all these connotations that I don't want to drag over into what Jesus is saying here. The word can be translated mature or complete, maybe complete as your heavenly Father is complete. And that's one of the lines where I hear people say, well, nobody can do that. You can't be mature like God is mature. You can't be complete like God is complete. So that's throw yourself on the mercy of God because you can't do that. But what has he just told them to do? What was the immediate command he'd given them before he said, now be mature like your Father in heaven is mature? What was it? Love your enemies. Can you do that? You can do that. What did God do? Did God love his enemies? So much that he gave his only begotten Son. You are never more like God than when you find it in your heart to love your enemies. In that moment, you are being like God. In your maturity, in your completeness. And if you want to use perfection, go ahead. But it's not just be like God in every way. Of course we can't be like God in every moral way. But in this way, loving your enemies. In that way, in that moment, we are being like God. Now the next section, and I'm gonna do it quickly because I need to get through this so I can finish tomorrow night. If you're looking on your handout there, it's the greater righteousness in relation to acts of righteousness or acts of piety. I just didn't want to be so redundant, so I said piety. But if you look at 6:1, he says, beware of practicing your righteousness before men in order to be seen by them. So we're back to righteousness again, and we're doing righteousness. He's talking about practicing righteousness. It's how you act. It's what you do. And so he's going to choose, guess how many? 3. You should guess 3, 6, or 9. Here it's 3. He's going to guess 3, or he's going to provide 3 external acts of righteousness that people might do. Things that you might do where others can see you. Spiritual disciplines that are visible to others. And he gives charitable giving as the first one. Giving to those who are in need. The second one is prayer, and the third one is fasting. If you want to be seen doing these things, you can. So the first one is the almsgiving. He says, "For then you'll have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give alms," that is, when you give charitably, "sound no trumpet before you." Of course, this is the origin of the idiom, "don't toot your own horn." Yeah? So don't toot your own horn when you're going to help somebody who's in need. You're going to help them out, or maybe you're going to contribute to something. Don't blow a trumpet to call attention to your almsgiving, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the narrow streets, that they may be praised by men. So almsgiving is a good thing. But motivation is important, and intention. And if you do it in order to be seen, then it's no good. I mean, it might be good for the person, and they'll get a benefit from it, and you'll receive the benefit of somebody thinking you're a generous person, but that's the end of your reward. So if you do it to get some adulation from other people, whatever they give you, that's the end of your reward. It's this idea of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them, in order to create some illusion of righteousness that might not be present, or a desire for you to receive glory that should rightly be given to God. What's your motivation in that moment? He says, "Truly I say, they've received their reward, but when you give alms, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing." That's that hyperbole again. Exaggeration for effect. "So that your alms may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." So that's the first one. The second one is prayer. Prayer is something that he's going to recommend you do in your prayer closet, because there's no temptation to do it for the external reward. Because he's not condemning almsgiving, and he's not condemning prayer. He's condemning public prayer when it's done to be seen by others. When your desire to pray publicly is for others to think, "My, how spiritual this person must be," or "Wow, they really are fantastic prayers." If that's your intent, then don't do it. Get in your closet and pray. "Truly I say to you, they've received their reward. But when you pray, go into your storage room. Just the place where it might not be the most comfortable room. And shut the door and pray to your Father who's in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you." And in praying, this is what that to be seen by others would look like. "Do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think they'll be heard for their many words. Don't be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask." And then he gives the model prayer. Not really the Lord's Prayer, they call it that. But if you want to see Jesus actually praying, like go to John 17, where he's praying for his disciples that they be one and that God protect them. Or go to the Garden of Gethsemane scene where he's praying to the Father, "If there's any other way, let me do it some other way." This is a legitimate prayer, but he's praying it to show us how to pray. What are the elements of prayer? Now, how many elements do you think he's going to give? Have you been paying attention now? 3 or 6? It's 6. 3 petitions directed to God and God's glory, 3 petitions directed to human need. So, our Father, not my Father, our Father. Now, this is Jesus saying this, who is the only one who really has the right to call God Father. And he doesn't say my Father, he says our Father, inviting us to call the God of all creation Father. And the "our" also sort of reminds us that prayer is something that it's good to do together. When we can pray together with others, our Father. And then Father. I mean, the images of someone who is close, someone who's aware of your need and is willing to act compassionately to meet your need, someone who shows you love, discipline when you need it. And I know not everybody had a good father, but think of a good father, and that's what this language reminds us of. But look at the rest of it. Our Father who is in heaven, which is a reminder of God is not just upstairs. You know, He's not just the old man upstairs. He's the eternal one who brought all things into being by speaking it into existence. And all things are under His rule. That's our Father. Near and yet other. And we really need to see God in both those capacities. We need to know He's near. We need to know He cares when you pray, that He hears you, that He's interested in your life. He wants the best for you. He's near to you. He knows how many hairs, even though they may be dwindling, the number going down of hairs on your head. Yeah, I'm at that point in life where somebody comes on the TV screen, and my comment to Ange is, he's got a beautiful head of hair. I mean, he could be on a unicorn, and all I'd see is, man, he's got a beautiful head of hair. I used to have hair like that. But that he's near to us, He knows us, He cares about us. But if God's just the old man upstairs, if He's just a good Father, well then the limits of what He can do are great. But He's in heaven, which reminds us of His otherness, His transcendence. It's just, there's so much in that one line, our Father who is in heaven, and now you get three petitions. Hallowed be your name, honor be to your name, your kingdom come, your will be done. We talked about the kingdom on Sunday night. It's already, it dawned, but there's a not yet aspect of it. So pray for the kingdom to come in its fullness. And the older you get, the more challenges you face, the more death you face in your family as you age, the more you long for the kingdom to come in its fullness. I notice that as I get up in my years. I didn't think too much about the kingdom coming when I was 18. But I'm 58 now. And there's a lot of things I look forward to when the kingdom comes in its fullness. So pray that. And thy will be done is like a synonymous statement. To pray for the kingdom to come in its fullness is to pray for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then the three petitions directed to human need. Give us today today's bread. He's very redundant in the way he phrases that. Give us today today's bread. You just can't think about that and not hear Exodus 16 when the Israelites are grumbling and complaining in the wilderness that God was just going to leave them out here to starve, and God gives them manna from heaven, bread. And what was the thing about that manna? Could they gather it up and put it in their closet and keep it for, 6 weeks or something like that? How long did that bread last? 1 day. So what had to happen the next day? More manna had to come. And if God didn't come through, what were you going to eat? Sand, dirt. So it's that recognition of dependence upon God. Even if you got bread in your pantry, still you should pray, give us today today's bread, a recognition of our dependence upon God. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Oh, I skipped one, didn't I? That forgiveness one. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Again, you get the picture of if you're not willing to give, it affects your ability to receive. Grant forgiveness because you've been shown forgiveness. And then lead us not into temptation. And if you just go back to the section we were just talking about, remember those vicious cycles I talked about? Those roads you start down that leads to destruction at the end of the road? This prayer for me is like praying, stop those vicious cycles. Help us not to travel down those paths that lead to murder and adultery and not telling the truth and seeking retaliation against our enemies rather than loving them. But deliver us from evil or from the evil one. There's the model. And then finally on fasting. Some of you probably feel like you're fasting now. Maybe you didn't get to eat before and you're ready to eat. Well, I'm not going to say much about fasting. Just to say, I think it's something we should talk more about and practice more. You look in the Old Testament, people fasted as they to show mourning, mourning. They weren't fasting on a diet. I know there's a very popular diet that has to do with fasting at certain times. My wife's got a phone and it dings in the morning, I think, when she can start eating, and it dings in the evening when she can't eat anymore. I don't think Jesus had in mind fasting for that purpose. But mourning, grief, when trying to determine God's will, as a way to say to God, I want your way, I want to know your way, I'm gonna not eat lunch and I'm gonna pray during that time. As a way to say, I want to know your will. Pharisees fasted Mondays and Thursdays every week. The whole nation fasted on the Day of Atonement. So they knew about fasting. Fasting is a good thing. There are reasons why we should fast. The only reason not to fast is so that others will think and know you're fasting. So don't put ash on your face. Don't give every indication of mourning and grief and all the reasons. Now, if somebody finds out you're fasting, it's fine. You don't lose your reward, but don't do it so they'll know. Funny how these public acts of piety can get really complicated. Just do them for the right reason, and then don't worry. Who knows, and whether what they think doesn't matter. But this is his instruction on these. This is the danger of our public acts of worship, that we end up doing it to be seen by others. And when we do, there's no reward in it. Not from God. All right, we're in position now to finish out tomorrow night, which we will. I hope to see you tomorrow night for the end. I think you get a bigger meal tomorrow night, right? So don't start fasting until Thursday morning or after your meal Wednesday night. Let me ask a blessing on you. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Amen.